Well, my story really starts as a young fella growing up in London. My father was an ambulance officer with the London Ambulance Service, and I grew up around ambulance stations. And I've pretty much worn a uniform my whole life, whether it be as a soldier in the British Army. I was a supervisor, which is a fancy name for a bouncer, wearing a suit and bow tie in London. And when I arrived in Australia, I applied for two positions. One was the Federal Police, which in those days was the Commonwealth Police, and the Ambulance Service. And I knew that I was going to be an ambulance officer after the interview for the Commonwealth Police. It didn't go well. It's a very amusing story where the police sergeant interviewing me was sitting back, leaning back on his chair with a clipboard asking me questions. And the questioning went along the line of, what's your name, where were you born? And then it came through to what form of transport did you use to get to Australia? I said, I flew. He said, which airline? I said, Air India. And then there was a pause, and then he said, height? And I said, about 33,000 feet, I think. And then he fell off the back of his chair and landed on his head, because he actually meant my height. And as he hit the ground, I thought to myself, you're going to be an ambulance officer, not a Commonwealth Police officer. So about 3 weeks after that, I received a notification to go to a building above the Wynyard Bank, above the Westpac Bank at Wynyard. And I go into a room with a group of other people, sat down, and they gave me a test, two tests. One was where I had to write an essay, and that was no problem. Could always write a story or tell a story, no issues at all. And I had to do a maths test, which was really not complicated maths. But I'd left school at 14 and a half, 15. It wasn't my hot topic, maths, and I failed their test. So this guy came out and he said, look, you've actually failed the maths test. He said, would you like to try again in 2 weeks? So I went away and really worked hard on the maths for 2 weeks with my sister-in-law to be, who was a teacher. And when I came back after 2 weeks, I walked in, sat down at the desk, and the guy said, oh, okay, you're in. I said, don't you want me to sit the test? And he said, no. He said, you're the first one that ever came back, so we figure we'll give you a run. And that's how I started in the ambulance service. I think persistence is the key here. I used to tell young people joining the ambulance service, or young paramedics that I came into, is when you have a trouble mastering something, then you've just got to persist. You've got to hang in there and keep working at it hard, and you really do get the rewards. For me, that would be emphasised by the fact that I applied in the late 70s to do this newfangled thing called an intensive care course, where I was going to be a paramedic, which was basically going from first aid into the realms of medicine, where I was going to be giving drugs and intubating people and putting cannulas in and doing all this stuff. And I remember on the pre-entry test for that I did, I scored really, really well, because the questions were about anatomy and physiologies and the names of bones and stuff like that. So I did well there, got into the course. When I started my course, which was course 11, the first obstacle that I struck was that they were suddenly talking about micrograms, grams, milligrams, how many micrograms in a milligram and stuff like that. And I had a lot of trouble getting my head around that. And the instructor that was running the course at the time, an absolutely great, legendary paramedic, he stayed back with me pretty much every night when everybody else had gone home, and we'd spend an hour going over O2 for oxygen, K for potassium, CO2, and getting the chemical symbols, and how many milligrams in a microgram and all that stuff. And after about 4 weeks of doing this, one evening we were sitting there and I went, oh, I get it. And suddenly the penny dropped. And from that moment on, I never looked back. And I think the key there is just keep hanging in there, just keep putting the hard work in, and you'll get to where you want to be. And that was me, course 11, intensive care paramedic. And I never looked back from there onwards. Yeah, I was working at Key Street there in the city, and I looked around and I thought to myself, you know, I might go for a promotion. And I can still remember my motivation to go for promotion was that there would be less people that could boss me around and tell me what to do. I clearly remember thinking that. So I applied to become a station officer, and I'd already done the superintendent's diploma, which you had to do at the time, and I'd worked my way through that, which again I found that quite hard, but hung in there, got through that. And I got a position as intensive care paramedic station officer out at Colleton in Western Sydney. And at that time, Colleton, was covering the Mount Druitt area, very tough area to work. We were the only intensive care between Parramatta and Penrith at the time. So there was a lot of work going down, and I had a great crew of people working with me. And we'd actually built the station from scratch. Physically, the building was being built while I was consulting in where I wanted things and stuff like that. I was given $50,000 for furniture and incidentals and stuff like that. And I was very, very proud on the fact that I handed back the boss 50 cents at the end of it. He said, how did you manage to get that close to the mark? I said, well, we actually went and bought coffees for everybody up the road and we added it to the bill. Otherwise, it would have been $10 short. Of course, you can't do that in the modern ambulance service, but you've got to remember that this was different times. I then got posted to Castle Hill, and I was the only intensive care paramedic in that area. There was no unit. I used to do on-call from home, and at one stage I was the second most called out officer in New South Wales. I was getting called pretty much every night, and it is wearing. It does wear you down to do a long shift at the station and then getting called out sometimes 2 and 3 times a night for big jobs up in that area, especially as the intensive care backup, because there was none at that time in that area. I applied for a promotional position again and was appointed as a Deputy Superintendent for North Sydney, and I was in charge of, I think, 5 or 6 stations, which included Wahroonga, Ryde, St Ives. I found that a little bit quieter, and it meant that I had to do less clinical and work more with people, which I really enjoyed. And I sort of had a love affair with my staff. I mean, they were great people, and I think that's the thing about the ambulance service is the diversity of the people within it. That's what makes it. And I've heard people over the years complaining and saying, the ambulance service didn't do the right thing by me, they might say. And I always had the same comeback. I said, who are you talking about? You're talking about the ambulance service. The ambulance service is you. It's me. It's that trainee that just joined. It's that boss over there. We're all the ambulance service. Don't blame the service for the issue that you're disgruntled about. The service is people. It's like a church. A church is not a building. A church is a group of people getting together. The ambulance service is a group of people to get together. We all put on a uniform, we wear the same uniform, and we go to work every day with one goal in mind. And when I speak about the history of the ambulance service, going back to 1895, right up to the day, for you people that might be watching this podcast at the moment, right up to this day, nothing has changed in regards of the number one role that we have is patient care. We've got to look out for our mates, look after our partners, but at the end of the day, it's all about the patient. And if you ever lose sight of that issue, then you probably need to start thinking about finding another career, because at the end of the day, it's all about looking after our patients and doing the best for them. Even the young paramedics of today that may not have been in the service that long, they would have already realised by talking to people, oh, you must see some terrible sights. What's the worst thing you've seen? Things like that get thrown at you. I think I never worked in country areas. I worked in a lot of city stations, but I could empathise with country officers. And I think there was a case in the city with a woman under a bus in the city, which was big at the time. It was a big job. It paralysed the city of Sydney for about 3 hours in the peak. And, I put my team in for commendations for that case, and the sneaky devils went behind my back and put me in for one, and we all went to the Opera House and we were all given, medals for being brave and doing heroic stuff. But I always remember Bruce, the husband of the lady that was under the bus, who unfortunately passed away. And I might add that with her injuries, which I'm not going to labour on, but they were really, really bad, and she was trapped for 3 hours, my team were able to get that woman to Royal North Shore, and she was still alive when we got to Royal North Shore. She ultimately died from blood loss through pelvic injuries, which, any paramedic would know a pelvic injury is very hard to control the bleeding. But that was a big job at the time, and it was news headlines. But I think that it's the little jobs. We don't all go to the big jobs all the time, and it's Joe and Janice Ambo getting in their ambulance, whether it be at Campbelltown, whether it be at Cronulla or Coonabarabran. They get in their vehicle and they go to that little old lady with chest pain who's upset and she's frightened, and they give her TLC, and they're nice to her, and they treat her like they would their own grandmother. I've always seen them as the important jobs. And I've had people say to me over the years, oh, he's a great paramedic, that person over there, and they might point to somebody. And I'd have to bite my bottom lip and say nothing, because their idea of what is great might not fall in line of what my idea is great. You're not a great paramedic because you can get an endotracheal tube down the right hole, or you always get your cannula in. The great paramedic is the one that treats every patient the same, whether they're a difficult patient or whether they're somebody that reminds you of your grandmother. You do your best and you treat them with respect, and you just do your best for every patient all the time. That's the definition of what I would call a great paramedic. I can empathise with country officers. When I was living up and doing the on-call at Castle Hill, I got called out one stormy night to a multi-vehicle accident just down the road, and one of the patients that was trapped with horrendous injuries, unconscious in the car, was my daughter's godfather and my best mate at the time. And I had to triage my friend out of it because his injuries were so severe, and work on other people, particularly a young girl that had a severed artery in her arm and was going to bleed out. This caused me to have dreams and nightmares for a number of years afterwards, and I always wondered whether I'd done the right thing, because when I got back to my friend, he had passed away. Remembering I'm on my own with multiple victims and no backup at that time for about half an hour before I got back up. And what offered me the most comfort was about 3 years later, I saw that 16-year-old girl walking into Woolies with her mother at the shopping centre. I recognised her, she didn't recognise me, and I knew that I'd made the right decision that night. And I think if you're asking me about jobs that stay with me, it's that one. And of course, you can clearly see I'm over it now, even though it happened 30 years ago. It doesn't bother me. Well, it does. But the good thing for the modern day paramedic is you young men and women of the ambulance service now, you've got a great service, you've got peer support, you've got chaplaincy service, you've got peer debriefers, and all these people that are going to support you. We weren't good at that back in the day, but we are good at it now. So have a wonderful career, and this is me, Norm, signing off.